Okay, so if you've got an armhole, lovely armhole shape, and you don't want, or a neck it can be on, and you don't want a wide facing, but you will need to neaten it in some way, you can use bias binding as a facing. It's a really nice way to do it. It's also a way of using on a curved hem, something like that. You can use facings as a way of finishing a curved hem. If you haven't cut a separate facing, you can use bias binding as a facing, same principle-ish. So reminder of joining bias binding. You cut it on the cross. If you haven't got that on the straight grain, the bias binding's on the 45 degree, which means it can stretch around curves, which is why it works as a facing. I tend to cut 4.5 centimetre depth. I'd rather it wider, and then we can just trim it down. If you haven't got it cut properly, you put right sides together and you can just line it up as a right angle and sew across like this to join your bias binding and trim it off, or have them cut. If they're cut, remember it's where you're sewing them that you line up, not the ends, because if you match the ends and then you start sewing your seam, then it's going to be stepped. So it's always matching the sewing lines, not the edges that you want to be sewing. Make sure we can see that. And again, there is a method where people cut a strip of bias binding, they sew an oblong and then cut it in a spiral. I don't tend to use that method. I join my bias as separate strips, because if you do it on that method, then all of these you cut through the stitching and then the joins can come undone. So I don't use that. People refer to it as a really quick and easy way of making bias binding. I still just prefer to do it traditionally. Then you would take it to your iron and press that seam open. Just finger press it, and then the extra little extension bit, you can just trim that off. So that's how you join to make one continual strip of bias binding. When you've got your armhole or neck, whatever you're going to sew it to, if that's this underarm side seam, when I first, make sure that your join, you do right sides together so that your join is on the inside. When I first start sewing, I leave a section flapping. Always cut far more bias binding than you think you're going to need. It's better to just discard the extra. So when you first start sewing, leave it flapping. Sew with the small seam allowance, so 1/4 inch, about 7 millimeters, and then you can just do that all the way around the armhole or neckline. So I'm just going to do this as a continual circle. So my sample's just quite small. So what you need to remember is, because it's whether you've got seam allowances and things that are added, you do need whatever seam allowance you use added on, because then you fold that under. So where I'm sewing is the finished edge. So remember that with the bias binding, if you're binding it, you don't have seam allowances because the binding wraps around the edge if you see the bias binding. But if you're using it as a facing, you would need to add this small seam allowance onto the pattern so adjust your pattern seam allowances accordingly. So if you say had 1.5 centimetre seam allowances on your pattern, you'd need to trim it down to the sewing lines there. When I get near to the start, I kept this extra flappy bit. I want to join this, and people don't always know quite how to join them. So leave them so there's 2 extension sections on your work. Always good to have more overlap. Always trim your threads off. You could just join them with a straight seam like this if you wanted to, but it's nice to have it at the 45 degree angle. So again, that was how we're going to overlap them. Remember, it's all about sewing lines and no sewing lines. So if my sewing line is going to be here, that's my sewing line at my angle. When I overlap this one on top, that's also my sewing line where they go together. So you could crease it. So I find it easier to put a finger crease like that. You could mark it with a piece of tailor's chalk, take it to the iron, and then just mark the two joining points, so you can see that this is folded at that right angle. The actual piece of binding, if you lay it flat, that folds down then to form a right angle, and this one goes up to form the right angle, and that's where the two are going to join. Now this is how I want it to sew. This is the wrong side, so I can sew my seam on there. You could trim that seam allowance off first of all, if that makes it easy, or you could sew on your creased line and then trim the seam allowances off. It doesn't matter, but again, this is why I kept this flappy. I didn't sew it right down, so I've got enough space to then join my two pieces of bias binding. And again, you don't match them on the outside edge, you match them at the sewing lines, otherwise you have a displaced section. You can see there, you can trim that extra pointy bit off. I've had a bit of a bird's nest, it happens to everybody. Just check that it's strong. If that happens, make sure that there's no issues, resew it if there is. And now I've got mine joined, but I've still got a gap there, so I just lay my binding back, undo, take your time, and get, it's just the bird's nest just happens where it pulls the top thread down, so just trim that off and make it come out. And now I'm just going to sew back around the armhole, so I haven't got a gap there. I like to open my seam allowance up and join that back again, and this just means that you've got no raw edges, no overlapping. Quick and easy way of joining your bias as a circle. So you would do that if you would doing a bias bound armhole as well as using it as a facing. It's the same method, no reasons for any raw edges on bias bindings. So what I've now got is an armhole that's got the bias attached. If you were using it as bound edge and this pattern had been cut, that was the finish line, so no seam allowance added, then that's divided and wrapped around. It would be pressed in like this and bound, and then you'd do a stitch in the ditch. So that's bias binding showing. Now I'm using this as a facing, so I've taken seam allowance off, so you need to make sure that you have that amount of seam allowance added or you've adjusted it. Now what I'm going to do, you could got a couple of different options now. You could seam neaten the edge and just press that under, and then that could be your facing. So if I turn my little inside out, obviously you need to press at all times, so you're pressing this round. Because it's on the bias, this will stretch out. So one way would be, as I said, you could overlock the edge and then press it here. You'll need to snip this because it's on an armhole. This still needs to be, seam allowances still need to be snipped to enable it to lay flat. Snip it all the way around. Okay, so your bias binding now, you can press that right on that seam, and then you can have it seam neatened, and then that is just your facing on the inside. Or if you could have some top stitching, or you could hand stitch it, do it so it's in 3. So you're now just going to, that's folded into this section here, just press that under, and then it is around. and then you could top stitch. Now depending how wide you want your top stitching to be, how deep you want your facing to be, depends on the size of the curve, you could trim your bias accordingly. So you might just want it, fold that to that seam line, and then I will pin and top stitch here. A minute, just find some pins. Alright, it was handy to have some pins. And again, press it. Under pressing is really important. Press as you go. So make sure that that's right on the edge. So in this instance, if I fold my edge and then do it this way, you'll be able to stretch that outside edge onto a curve. Just take your time pressing and pinning, because you don't want any chevroning, so you don't want any rippling on your facing. So this is important to take your time getting this all done. You will have, in this instance, some row of top stitching showing, but that top stitching makes a nice feature. Make sure you measure and that this is equal distance, and when you press it you can see that the bias then allows that to stretch around the curve. And you can do that. Work your way around the armholes. You could trim this down if you didn't want it as thick, as bulky. If you've got bulky outer fabric, then it's a nice way then to finish an armhole with a cotton bias or a satin bias, and it helps to reduce the bulk. So you don't have to have the same fabrics outside as the bias. And you can see how now work my way round over that shape. And then this is what you don't want, so you just need to work, make sure that you might need to stretch that outside edge to make sure it fits, but that's the beauty. You could understitch this before you do it as a facing. On a facing we always understitch it first, that's another option, and press and see how it goes. But because I'm top stitching it, holds it back anyway. So if you were seam neatening it and just pressing it back as a facing, you would definitely put understitching here, but if you're using it as a binding and stitching it down, then there's less requirement for that understitching. Again, make sure that it lays flat and that there's no puckering on the other side when you stitch it down. So I will stitch this, and then you'll see the end result. Once I've done all the pinning, pressing, you can see how that then manipulates and goes around the armhole shape. Just takes time. Make sure you take your time, that that seam's right on the edge, and that you have an equal depth of your facing, because that's shown on the outside as a top stitch. And then I'll bring that back, start at the underarm, because that's where you want it. And as long as your bobbin stitches well enough, you can stitch from the inside. Otherwise you'll have to work, and like you would with stitching the ditch, and work your way around. I've rushed this, so these aren't necessarily the same width, so please take your time on your sample and make sure that it's all neat. Stitch on the edge, so just do a nice edge stitch, because you want to catch the raw edges underneath, especially if you've trimmed that binding down, and go all the way around. And then ensure that you stretch that binding so it lays flat, so there's no puckers of the garment. Okay. And then what your end result is, and obviously you could use a contrast fabric to neaten it, and then your end result is that's the inside of the garment. Or you could use, if you wanted as a contrast, you could have sewn it inside out, and then you've got a nice contrast strip showing as a feature on an armhole, so it works both ways. This could have been, instead of sewn on the inside of the garment, sewn on the outside, because that is self-neatened all the way around. So that's the inside, and that's a nice neat facing, and on the outside you've just got the row of top stitching. So you have used a bias strip as a facing, or you could do it as a feature if you stitched it on the other way round, and then this could be a contrast fabric. Okay.